As the world is devoured by an ancient evil, you are summoned to relive the past and try to save the world. Omensight is a narrative hack-and-slash game from Spearhead Games, the same developers that created stories The Path of Destinies. You play as the Harbinger, an ethereal warrior who protects the world from evil as you relive a single day over and over again. Omensight was a great successor to Stories, which I played a ways back when I didn't even do reviews yet. However, Omensight is not perfect and suffers from confusing combat and the overuse of cinematic camera angles, among other things. I really enjoyed this game despite its flaws, so let's get to the meat of it. The gameplay of Omensight is divided into the combat portion and the narrative portion. We'll start with the combat as it is the bulk of the gameplay. Omensight's combat is a typical hack and slash with a menagerie of special moves that gives the combat a distinctive flair. The player can fast attack, heavy attack, and dodge. By hitting enemies, the player gains energy that can be used to perform special attacks, like instant kills or energy blasts. In addition to that, there are a few cooldown abilities that can be unlocked. While one can go through the game just hacking up enemies, you are rewarded for chaining special attacks and fighting in a stylish manner. This really only amounts to experience points, but combat was also far more enjoyable when you combined abilities. The abilities had a lot of synergy with each other, and chaining attacks was usually fluid and satisfying. On the face of it, this is all good, but there are some problems with the combat. The first most glaring issue is the camera. Omensight has a cinematic camera, meaning that each scene has a special position that the camera is placed at in order to create better visuals. Basically like how Journey's camera works. The problem is that camera persists into combat encounters. Very often I found myself with weird camera angles that made it hard to see what was happening during combat. I would say that in roughly half of the combat encounters that I had, there was some issue with camera angles. While on the topic of the player's view, there was also the issue of the destructible terrain. The environment could have a variety of destructible elements, mainly broken pillars, that the player could use to harm enemies. The problem was that when a pillar fell, and especially when multiple did, which was quite often, there was so much visual noise that I could not see what was happening, almost always resulting in me taking significant damage. Given that I could not control the camera, there was little I could do to alleviate this issue. I loved the destructible elements, but there needed to be a way to not suffer from the crippling blindness that was often associated with them. The other side of gameplay is the narrative side, where the player chooses how they will progress through the story. The main part of this is which of the main characters the player chooses to follow for any given day. Most of the characters will not lead to a significant amount of story progression, but they always give the player a tidbit of information that could lead to the right path. The other element of narrative gameplay is when the player occasionally chooses to help or fight a character. Between the two of these, the player can choose a variety of paths throughout the day. I enjoyed the narrative gameplay because each decision was a puzzle. You had to decide who would give the player the most information based on what you would tell them, or you would have to gauge how each character would react to your actions based on how well you knew them. There was not a lot of consequences to these actions, as there did not appear to be any time limit on the game, and every path could be replayed if you wanted to follow another route, but that did not stop the narrative gameplay from being rather engaging. The narrative was by far the best part of this game. Omensight's story is divided into two parts, the main gameplay and secret notes that tell the player about a character's past. Each of the 5 main characters is actually well built. What initially seems to be a boring archetype ends up being fleshed out, especially through the secret notes. The more that you learn about each character, the more that you understand why they play the role that they do in the story. Now, it is to be noted that while the story may appear to be branching, calling it a branching story would be a misnomer. It is actually a linear storyline. The player never has a real choice that changes the story. When there are options, it is a question of following a dead-end path that may give some little insight, or following the path that progresses the game. You can end up playing more or less days in order to eventually discover the right path, but it's like following side quests in a linear RPG. They give you tools to progress, but don't change how the storyline progresses. Don't get me wrong here, this is not a bad thing. I do not think that Omensight would have gained anything from being branching. That would have just pulled resources away from making a great linear story. It is just worth noting that you are in for a linear storyline. The story itself is mainly about leadership. It examines how a leader should act and what the mantle of leadership does to a person or pushes them to do. For instance, the main conflict is created by a leader who fails to consider the will of their subjects, that phrase being intentionally vague. Each character either struggles with how to deal with their position or fails to support leadership. It was actually a fairly poignant narrative that causes the endings to make a lot more sense. Kudos to Spearhead for actually making an engaging and meaningful story in a game. That does not happen often in this industry. The aesthetics of Omensight are a successor to stories The Path of Destinies. They are cartoonish while not being garish or childish. I cannot take anything away from the artistic style because it just works. The actual visuals were often the result of the game's cinematic camera. Basically, the developers made it so that the camera was always in a good angle to get cool shots. Outside of the glaring issues that I noted when I discussed the combat, the cinematic camera was great and actually made the world look quite good. There were a few times where lag caused some problems, as Omensight seemed to have trouble rendering large open spaces, especially when a character created a bridge, but outside of that, the game looked brilliant. Overall, Omensight is a brilliant narrative experience that has an okay hack and slash attached to it. The cinematic camera angles that made the world look so good were often a hindrance to the player during combat experiences, that being coupled with an excess of visual noise that made tracking combat quite difficult at times. Despite the problems, the combat was enjoyable and generally did not get in the way of the narrative. The characters were well made, and the overall story did a good job of examining the qualities of a good leader. There are certainly areas where Omensight could have improved, but what is there is quite enjoyable and is a worthy successor to their previous game, Stories: The Path of Destinies. If this game intrigues you and you like story-driven games, you'll certainly be getting good value picking this up. If you're looking for smooth and satisfying hack and slash, Omensight will be okay, but there are other better hack and slash games on the market. If you're in it for the story, then you can pick the game up on Steam or as a pre-release on the Switch, for which it will be out on December 13th, if you have one of those. With that, thanks for watching, and as always, enjoy the rest of your day.